The case that made me give up being a private investigator. Written by twocantherapper. I'm putting this up here because I want to keep it separate from my other case files. You'll see why. For now, just know that it didn't feel appropriate keeping it with the endless logs on cheating spouses and tracked down runaway teens. I'll level. I almost didn't type up this file at all. I nearly burned it. I'd have been more than happy to pretend the following never happened. I changed my mind because I figured that if I stayed silent, somebody else might accidentally go poking down the rabbit hole. So yeah, my story. What you're about to read took place back in the early 2010s. I didn't know it when I signed the initial contract with Hannah Boxstead, but it was the last case I ever took on as a private investigator. Something about the whole gig didn't feel right after. I don't think you'll blame me for moving on to my current career as a debt collector, though. It started out routine enough. I got the call on a Monday morning while I was groaning away a hangover in the steam from a piping cup of black mud. London is a big place, and I'm good at finding people in it. My caseload was never slim, let's put it that way. The phone ringing first thing on a Monday wasn't unusual. The nature of the case is what excited me enough to put it to the top of my schedule. The caller was Hannah Boxstead, 56, from Hackney. The case, her son Ian. Namely, what the London Metropolitan Police weren't telling her about how he died. Hannah didn't agree with the Met's verdict that Ian died by his own hand. When she came to my office that afternoon, she brought screenshots of private conversations, screenshots containing her son's plans, dreams, and hopes for the future. The most recent of which was around booking a holiday, written a few hours before his alleged self-inflicted death. Alone, these would not have led me to suspect that I was dealing with anything other than a grieving mother in denial. But then she showed me the photos that she'd sneaked off his body when she'd gone to identify it. Sure, Ian was covered head to toe in deep cuts. His nose was broken and his naked body was covered in dirt like he'd been sleeping in a dumpster. It was the body of someone who went through a lot of emotions and hardships in their final moments. I agreed with Hannah Boxstead, though. This wasn't the body of someone who'd showed themselves out of the land of the living. Folk who choose their own ending don't die with screams on their faces. Ian was found about 3 days after his death in a car park behind a warehouse. There were drugs in his system, but not at the levels that should induce dangerous behavior or overdose. Hannah's research had been thorough, and I'd tailed enough junkie kids to confirm the charts she showed me didn't show anything more than a 19-year-old putting a little extra kick in his weekend. The cuts and negligible levels of party favors in his system are what led the Met to rule self-murder. To Hannah's delight, I disagreed on both fronts. The wounds couldn't have been self-inflicted. There were too many inch-long cuts in hard-to-reach places for Ian to have made them himself. There were also hundreds of them. He'd have passed away long before getting the 2 fatal gashes on his wrists. They were also far too straight, far too precise to be self-inflicted. Ian hadn't been found with a blade, so the ruling was that he'd used broken glass. I've been in enough bar fights to know shards of glass can't make cuts that perfect. The question, though, was this. Ian Boxstead's body was filthy and covered in lacerations. So, where was the blood? The Met weren't being honest with Hannah Boxstead, and I promised her I would find out why. It's a shame that once I had to start being dishonest with her too. Not because I'm a liar, but because I couldn't risk her digging deeper. My first stop was the possible crime scene. Ian had been found by a homeless guy on an abandoned industrial estate in Bethnal Green. It turned out to be a waste of an oyster swipe, on the initial journey at least. The Met had already picked the place clean, and a week's worth of the city's background motion had long since washed away any evidence that they might have missed. I figured this would probably be the case before I got there, though. I needed somewhere to begin, and on my usual runaway brat hunts, visiting the last known location was a good way to find the first trail. So yeah, I didn't waste too long in that empty car park the first time I went. The second time, the time that I woke up there, is a different story. We'll get to that though. At the time, I had no reason to be suspicious. I did have a need to send some photos I'd taken from my phone to Hannah Boxstead though. More to show her that I was already on the case than anything else. That's why I ducked into the shadowy internet cafe/money transfer point across the road from the vacant lot of empty warehouses and abandoned cars. The cramped, poorly lit room was busy. 2 beefy blokes behind the counter and a dozen or so scrawny guys hunched over keyboards, crammed into a room built with no more than 8 occupants in mind. They had a nervous look about them. None made eye contact, not only with me, but with each other. They were all working in silence. All I could hear was the whirling of towers, the tapping of keys, and the buzz of a fat blue bottle making drunken loops all around the ceiling fan. It wasn't till I sat down and booted up the aging Windows 98 computer that I noticed the lack of speakers. None of the 8 pounds an hour PCs had them. There wasn't even any blaring, tinny, badly tuned local radio from behind the counter either. A distinct oddity in London. The towers were also missing headphone or aux jacks. The audio cable slots of both of mine and my neighbor's computer had been crudely melted closed with a lighter or a small blowtorch. I wish I'd been curious enough to investigate this further. I'd have saved myself a lot of hassle later on. As it was, I just shrugged and emailed the new crime scene photos across to Hannah Boxstead, shrugging off the massive red flag as one of life's little weird moments. My second line of inquiry was the list of Ian's friends provided by Hannah Boxstead. One of them, a lad based in Elephant and Castle, agreed to meet me. An aspiring solicitor named Asim Anad, a former classmate of the deceased. I was surprised to find Asim Anad was as eager to meet me as I was him. He'd been with Ian on the night of the latter's suspicious passing. He had video evidence to prove it too. After some brief introductions at his ENC flat, mine clipped and impatient, his shaky and hushed. He showed me a series of clips on his iPhone. I'll spare you the red herring. The illegal rave Asim, Ian, and a handful of other future lawmakers had visited that night wasn't in the warehouse that I would soon wake up outside of, covered in my own sweat and gibbering like a madman. It was a similar disused unit about a mile away, one that was regularly used for such underground events, judging by the intricacy of the sound system and the lighting rigs visible on the small screen. The first few videos were normal. Ian and his friends laughing, dancing, and smelling the white powder on somebody's coffee table. It was the fourth video that made the color drain from both mine and Asim's face. It was about 30 seconds into the clip. Almost out of shot by the speaker, a few feet behind the gurning Asim and two girls, that Ian changed. Not started changing. Changed. It was instantaneous. One frame he was Ian Boxstead, and the next he was not. In the space of a single strobe flash, Ian went from grinning and dancing to standing stock still. He was so tense and upright that you'd be forgiven for thinking some unseen spirit had rammed an iron rod up and through his spine to the base of his skull. Plenty of the other revelers had twisted, contorted faces. Powders and pills can have that effect. That's why I think none of them reacted to Ian's new face with the same gulp and sharp intake of breath as I did. One moment, Ian's face had been locked in a happy, toothy grin. The next frame, they were still in a toothy grin all right, but it was far from happy. It was far from anything. After the switch, the corners of Ian's mouth curled up so much that they almost spiraled in on themselves. The lips between them were stretched so tautly that splits and trickles of blood appeared within a few seconds. New eyes bulged far further than any chemical could induce. Rings of purple flesh surrounded them as they twitched and heaved in the sockets, trying to free themselves from his face. His eyelids folded back and in on themselves, exposing the pulsing veins and capillaries on their undersides. Over the next 5 or 6 videos, Asim showed me Ian standing in the same spot with that twisted grin from various different angles. No matter where Asim had filmed from, the bolt upright Ian was visible in the background, unmoving for what must have been a couple of hours. Asim had studied the footage well, because it took him pointing out the strange way Ian was breathing for me to notice, which was impressive considering that I made a comfortable living out of noticing things. Ian Boxstead was alternating which lung he breathed out of. Left, then right. Left, then right. Nostrils flaring alternately in short, arrhythmic burst. He stood there leaning to and fro slightly as the opposing halves of his chest rose and fell like a seesaw, right until the final 2 videos. I'm a proud man. I value my stoicism. It brings me no joy at all to admit that I let out a high-pitched yelp when, in the penultimate clip, the grinning statue did the unthinkable. It moved. On a trigger known only to whatever mind lay behind those bulging eyes, the Ian thing turned 180 degrees on its left heel. It marched through the crowd of gurning ravers, moving its legs with stiff but fluid swings like a parading soldier or a 50s lead wind-up toy. Before the footage ended, it was standing in front of a man-sized speaker, face inches away from the vibrating surface. The last footage was of Asim vomiting purple fluid into a bin. Over his shoulder, Ian Boxstead was clearly visible. He was pushing his head into the speaker with such force that his skull rattled violently. He held it there for a full 5 minutes, until dark streaks started to pour from his ears and pull at his chin. Before the clip cut to black, I was given a brief glance of his mangled, broken face. The curled grin was gone. The nose was broken, and the blood from the fresh wound was mixed with confused tears. Ian had vanished after that. Asim Anad agreed to send me the footage on the condition that I never contacted him again. He was very clear that he'd only reached out to me to pass the torch, so to speak. He wanted out. I should have followed his example. Ain't hindsight a bitch? I uploaded the clips to YouTube when I got back to my office and I took a nap. This is actually a pro gamer move in the world of private investigation. If someone is hiding, then they can't resist testing how findable they are. Besides, I had no idea what I was looking at anyway. I was hoping just as much for an explanation of the kind of psychological break that caused Ian's behavior as I was looking for another lead. My theory was something neurological at that point, you understand. Something still grounded in the rational, the explainable. When I woke a few hours later, I still had no explanation. But I did have another lead. Among the hundreds of cries of fake which protected my montage video from a takedown, there was one that offered a glimmer of hope. Well, what I thought at the time was hope. What was it the red squid guy said in Star Wars? Anyway, one commenter left a lengthy response urging me to reach out. The poster claimed to have witnessed the exact same thing at another nightclub a few months prior, and they had a video to prove it. My mind began racing with visions of me on the front page of the papers, the hero that exposed a new dangerous high killing London's youth. I couldn't reply to Speaker Writer 81 fast enough. I fist pumped when he responded in 5 minutes to tell me that he lived so close that I could be on his doorstep in about 10. The journey was short, but not simple. The BlackBerry route planner took me down alleys and side passages that I hadn't known of before, despite living in the area for over a decade. The ruckus of the main roads dimmed into quietness with each turn. The amber haze of light pollution that I associated with civilization less and less visible on each new unfamiliar street. My phone assured me the journey had indeed only taken 10 minutes by the time I reached the right row of terraced houses in the maze of terraced houses. It felt a lot longer though, and my legs ached to prove it. Other than a hallway light on the second floor of the first house I passed, a bedraggled fox digging through a wheelie bin was the only sign of life. I shivered despite the night air not being cold. Speaker Writer 81 lived at house number 12 on this suburban street. When I knocked on the red wooden door, despite no lights being on in this house either, I found it unlocked and swinging open on a single light tap from my knuckles. I walked in, half expecting to find signs of a burglary or a struggle, maybe even a squat full of junkies and vagrants. What I didn't expect to find was the cleanest and emptiest house I'd ever come across. The house was uninhabited, not just by people, but by anything. I spent nearly 2 hours pulling up floorboards and scouring empty cupboards, determined not to have wasted time on what now felt like an obvious prank. Well, what at first felt like an obvious prank. The more time I spent pulling apart the house, though, the more my frantic searching regained solid purpose. Something was wrong with that house, and until I found whatever I was looking for, I couldn't put my finger on exactly what. My first guess was show home, but even there decked with some kind of furniture beyond built-in cupboards. The house's exterior had been filthy and dilapidated, like the rest of the street. The inside couldn't have been further from this. With the exception of the exposed concrete and floorboards, even the kitchen and bathroom had no tiles or linoleum. Every surface had been cleaned to sterility. Recently, too. Some of the walls were still damp, and the faint acrid tang of bleach was still in the air. What furniture did remain, the aforementioned cupboards and walled-in sinks and bathroom facilities, had received the same treatment. They'd been scrubbed to immaculacy. I doubt I could have even found a flake of dead skin, never mind Speaker Writer 81 or his case-cracking footage. In the end, I gave up and pulled my phone out to call a taxi. The poor woman on the other end of the line had never heard of the address, and neither had her computer system. This was one normality-ignoring lump of weirdness too many for me. I did what I always do when I feel out of my depth. I saw red. My profanity-laden attempts to explain my location were loud. That's why I didn't hear the guy with the cricket bat unlock the front door. When I came to, I was strapped to a chair. The top of my skull ached, and when I moved, I could feel the peeling of dried blood on the back of my neck. I wasn't alone. 3 of the men from the currency exchange/internet cafe were standing over me. They weren't around for long, though. I had just enough time to start yelling at them, reminding them that I could recognize them and knew who they were, when they wordlessly turned and left single file through a heavy metal door. The room it clanged shut behind was as unsettlingly clean as Speaker Writer 81's house. I knew I must have been moved at least a few miles because the vents and pipes on the whitewashed brick walls screamed industrial warehouse. The smell of bleach was stronger here, strong enough to cause me to cough and gag as I struggled against the thick belts holding me in place. There were other smells too: disinfectant, chlorine, and other detergent vapors that sting the nostrils and burn the lungs. For a moment, I worried that they were gassing me, but when the actual reason for their bringing me here was revealed itself, I realized I wasn't so lucky. The only object in the room aside from myself and the chair was a small Bluetooth speaker, standing alone on the polished concrete a few feet in front of me. It was one of those portable jobs that couldn't have been any larger than my fist. Only a few seconds after I paid it attention, the green LED indicating a paired connection shimmered into life. The music it played into the echoey room was tinny, a warbling mix that was all treble and no bass. The tune itself wasn't remarkable. It was some pop hit that had been popular that summer. Katy Perry or Taylor Swift, I think. How much that screeching tones made my face itch immediately caught my attention, though. I began yanking and pulling at the thick belts, no longer trying to free myself, just a hand to scratch my face. Within a few seconds, the unpleasant scratch across every facial feature had me twisting them in agony. It was at this point that I stopped seeing red and started seeing yellow. Before I could scream, though, there was a click. The glare of the strip bulb cutting out and throwing the bleach-coated room into darkness took me completely by surprise. Surprise that I didn't have long to wallow in. The muscles in my back tensed. The moment the light left, I felt something other than the shadow step in to take its place. Something behind me. Some presence I was aware of as the leather belts stopping me from running for the door. I couldn't hear it, but I knew from the growing prickling replacing the sensation of dried blood on my neck that it was taking slow, deliberate steps towards me. I did scream now, a loud scream. A scream even the hypervigilant machismo I inherited from my father isn't ashamed of. It was when those screams bounced and echoed off the hidden walls that I noticed they, and the waves of tinny noise from the speaker, weren't behaving right. They weren't reverberating evenly around the room as they should have been. They were being directed. Every yell, every bar of tinny pop music rushing back past my ears much louder on the return journey. Every sound zipped and whirled like a passing freight train, pulled behind me either by or into whatever was now gut-churningly close to the back of my neck. The itching in my face had progressed to burning by this point, as had the hot breath on the back of my neck. I wrenched against the belt so hard that rivers of warm redness descended from the new flashes of pain at my wrist and ankles. My yells, pleas, and screams were all sucked behind me, whooshing past my ears and vanishing without an echo or reverb. The scalding breath moved up to behind my left ear. The corners of my mouth felt more and more like they were soaked in acid with every inch that it moved. I must have still been screaming, but I could no longer hear it. The barrage of sound ripped through every bone and ligament of my body, crushing and squeezing them with an intense pressure that I cannot explain, nor do I ever want to be able to. The excruciating vibrations reached their final crescendo when the thing they gave form placed a clawed, bleached-smelling hand on my shoulder. Everything stopped. In an instant, the burning, the crushing pressure on my insides, and the boiling grip of that gnarled, translucent hand were gone. That would have relieved me were it not for everything else going along with them. My limbs, a moment ago screaming in agony as they fought a losing battle against the leather bindings, had gone. My throbbing eyes no longer throbbed, because they no longer anything. My screaming had ceased because I had no mouth to scream with. I was nothing beyond disembodied awareness, a bodiless sense of dread and wilting sanity, drifting alone in a void. At least, I was alone at first. Once I was aware of my lack of surroundings, things started to notice me. Things that moved and shifted in the dark. Curious things intrigued by movements in this place where all had been still since before there was a universe for our star to be birthed in. I could feel or sense or know them circling around me. Their hunger was palpable. It filled the empty space, and if I had lungs, the fear I became would have burst them. I felt the first of these unspeakable presences crash upon me when, for a second time, everything stopped. I could feel the tarmac against my cheek. That didn't amaze me as much as the fact that I could feel my cheek, and my face, and my arms, and my legs, and all the other parts I was supposed to have. They hurt, but they weren't burning. Two good reasons to open my eyes. I was in a car park by a warehouse. The same car park the unfortunate homeless man had found the even more unfortunate Ian Boxstead's body in. I was naked, bruised, and covered in a few cuts, but I was alive. As my memories of how I'd found myself naked, hurt, and on the concrete started to return, so too did a panic rise in my gut. I ran screaming from that car park in the end, looking up to see the 3 men from the sterilized room, one of them menacingly holding a cricket bat, looking down from a window on the top floor was enough. Their message in their hate-filled expressions clear. That was a warning. Don't go poking around where you're not wanted. At first, I thought that they were worried that I'd expose them. Now, I know better. I never accepted another case. I shut down my company and all websites and social accounts. But not before crying under a cold shower for 8 hours straight. I've never gone back to Bethnal Green. I don't know if whatever happened is limited to there. I've avoided spending too long around speakers in the years since though, just in case. I told Hannah Boxstead the trail had run cold. What else could I do? She broke down into uncontrollable sobs. This is when I first noticed something had changed in me. Her tears meant nothing to me. They prompted no pity, yet at the same time, no annoyance. Emotionally, I was completely blank. It's been the same ever since. My psychiatrist uses words like sociopath or personality disorder. I know better though. When that thing touched my core in the void, it took something with it. It left me half full, partially empty, missing whatever part of the spirit or soul that allows you to connect with others. It's probably why I do so well as a debt collector. The sight of crying mothers and sobbing children does nothing to me as I break a father's arms over insignificantly small missed gambling payments. That's why I don't want you to go digging. I don't want to risk anyone following me down the rabbit hole. As scared as I was, the thing in Bethnal Green has blessed me. It chose me. I was worthy, where Ian and the men from the internet cafe were not. It's a burden being their chosen. It's one I wish I'd never taken. But now that it's mine, I will never release it. Those things in the dark are mine. Their blessing is mine. When I'm ready, I will go back to Bethnal Green. I will turn on my speakers and meet them again. Once more, I will bask in their liberating touch, and I refuse to share it with anyone.